If your voice is not grounded enough, others will not listen to you even when you are right. The world does not follow those who speak the most. The world follows those who make others feel certain. And in the next few minutes, you will realize why every time you speak is quietly deciding your power, your influence, and the direction of your own life. The moment you speak in front of another person, everything begins to be decided, not by what you say, but by what they feel from your presence. People do not believe you because you are right, they believe you because they feel safe listening to you. They do not follow you because you are intelligent, they follow you because they sense steadiness. And here is the harsh truth very few people dare to face. If your voice lacks clarity, if your energy is unstable, if your words reveal hesitation, then no matter how right you are, the world will still turn away. No one hands leadership to someone who has not yet stood firmly within the sound of their own voice. Many people believe that, as long as they are skilled, as long as they work hard, as long as they have value, their voice will eventually be heard. But reality operates in the opposite direction. You are heard only when the way you show up makes others feel certain. A voice is not merely a tool for transmitting information. It is a survival signal. It tells the person in front of you whether you are in control or in defense, whether you are leading or seeking approval. Even when you are silent, the way you stand, the way you breathe, the way you hold rhythm is still sending a message. And people read those signals far faster than they process content. This is why some people speak very little, yet every sentence makes others stop and listen. And why others speak endlessly, yet leave no weight behind. The issue is not the quantity of words, but the inner state behind them. When you are chaotic inside, your speech becomes rushed. When you are afraid inside, your voice softens. When you lack clarity inside, your sentences become defensive and drawn out. The world does not respond to what you want. The world responds to the state you carry when you open your mouth. This is not injustice, this is law. And this law does not care who you are, what you want, or how long you have tried. It cares about one thing only: how people feel when they hear you speak. If they feel uncertainty, they pull back. If they feel unsafe, they doubt. If they feel led, they follow. Every journey of taking control of your life begins at this moment. The moment you stop blaming circumstances, stop waiting for others to understand you, and begin to look directly at how you are showing up. Not to attack yourself, but to take responsibility. Because when you master your voice, you master the most important gateway connecting your inner world to the outer world. And from that gateway, all influence, all choices, and all paths begin to open. There is a very familiar moment many people have experienced but few dare to name. It is the moment when you speak a lot, explain carefully, share sincerely, yet the room drifts away, the listener's eyes wander, their breathing is no longer with you, and when you stop, no action follows. Not disagreement and not agreement, just empty silence. In that moment, if you are aware enough, you will recognize a painful but necessary truth. Speaking a lot does not equal leading. Communicating does not equal creating influence. And good intention does not replace clarity. People do not follow words, they follow the feeling of being directed. When you speak a lot and no one follows, it is very likely that you are seeking validation rather than offering direction. It is very likely that you are speaking to be understood instead of speaking to create a decision. It is very likely that you are trying to fill silence, because inside you have not yet stood firmly with your own thoughts. The old world of most people operates this way. They enter conversations with a desire to be accepted. They add words to feel safe. They explain to avoid being misunderstood. They speak quickly to avoid being interrupted. But those very behaviors drain weight from the message. When you fear being misunderstood, you over-explain. When you fear rejection, you soften. When you fear silence, you lose rhythm. And the listener senses all of this, even without conscious awareness. Their body reacts first. Their nervous system receives the signal that the person in front of them is uncertain. And when that signal appears, their brain will not grant leadership. You may have good ideas, correct solutions, real experience, but if your state is defensive, everything slips away. This is the unconscious loop many people are trapped in. They think the problem is content, so they learn more knowledge. They think the problem is skill, so they learn more techniques. But they ignore the deepest layer, the inner state at the moment you open your mouth. You can recognize this loop through very small signs. You often begin by apologizing before you speak. You often add softening phrases. You often explain reasons instead of stating what needs to be said. You often finish speaking, then doubt yourself and add more. Each of these behaviors sends a signal that you are not yet grounded, and the world reads that signal very fast. The moment you realize this is uncomfortable but liberating, because for the first time you understand that you do not lack value, you lack mastery. No one follows not because you are not good enough, but because you are not clear enough. And clarity does not come from speaking more. It comes from knowing what needs to be said and what should be held back. It comes from daring to let silence exist. It comes from trusting that one grounded sentence carries more weight than 10 softened ones. When you look directly at this moment, you begin to shift from reacting to choosing. You no longer speak on autopilot. You begin to ask before you speak, why am I saying this? Where do I want the listener to go after this sentence? What state am I carrying? And simply asking these questions begins to slow the rhythm. When the rhythm slows, the voice deepens. When the voice deepens, the words tighten. When the words tighten, the message gains weight. This is the first turning point of the journey. Not loud, not dramatic, but real. The moment you realize that other people's silence is not always rejection. Sometimes it is a reflection showing that you need to stand more firmly before expecting anyone to follow. And from this moment, the story is no longer about how to speak better. It becomes about how to be more clearly present every time you speak. Before any transformation can occur, it is necessary to look directly at the old world where most people live and operate every day. It is a world driven by reaction rather than choice. When asked, they answer immediately. When doubted, they explain right away. When uncertain, they add more words. Everything happens so fast that there is no pause for thinking to emerge. And within that lack of pause, the inner world gradually loses control. Fear of silence is the root of many weak communication behaviors. Silence makes many people feel empty, as if saying nothing means disappearing from the conversation. So they fill the space with words, with reasons, with unnecessary details. But silence is not the enemy. Silence is where power begins to form. When you cannot tolerate silence, you speak from fear. And when you speak from fear, the listener will sense instability no matter how well you try to hide it. The old world teaches people to react quickly so they are not left behind. But reacting quickly does not mean being right. Fast reactions usually come from self-protection, not from clarity. You speak to protect your image. You speak to avoid being misunderstood. You speak to prove that you have value. But the more you try to prove, the more you reveal that you do not yet trust yourself. And that is the greatest paradox. The more you try to convince others, the more you show that you are not grounded. Inner ambiguity is a very subtle state. It is not loud. It appears as mild hesitation, lack of decisiveness, uncertainty in the breath, and a rising tone at the end of sentences. Others do not need to analyze it, they only need to feel it. Their body responds by keeping distance, not committing, not acting. Not because they dislike you, but because they do not feel safe enough to follow. The old world leads many people to believe the problem lies outside. The listener is difficult. The circumstances are unfavorable. The timing is not right. But if you observe long enough, you will see a repeating pattern. The same message spoken by one person is heard while spoken by another is ignored. The difference is not information, but state. Leaders do not speak more. They speak less, but every sentence has a place to stand. They do not rush to fill space. They let silence do its work. They do not explain to be accepted. They say what needs to be said, and then they stop. And that stopping creates weight. To step out of the old world, you need one thing that seems simple but is very difficult. Dare to slow down. Dare not to answer immediately. Dare to let one breath pass before you speak. In that breath you return to your center. You check your state. Where am I speaking from? From fear or from clarity? From defense or from intention? The moment you begin asking this question, you no longer fully belong to the old world. You are standing at the boundary. One side is familiar reaction, the other is the ability to choose, and every journey of identity change begins at that boundary. When you realize that you do not need to speak to exist, you become able to speak to lead. When you no longer fear silence, you begin to master rhythm. And when you master rhythm, you begin to rewrite how the world responds to you. This is the deepest foundation for everything that comes next. Every system has a breaking point. Human beings are no different, and that breaking point does not appear when everything is calm. It appears when pressure rises. When time is compressed, when attention is focused on you, when an answer is expected immediately. In that moment, the truth reveals itself without disguise. If your inner world has not been trained, your voice will change. Your breathing will shorten, your words will lose structure. You may try to stay calm, but the body does not know how to lie. Pressure is like a strong light shining directly into the inner world. It exposes what you have not yet mastered. Many people believe they are fine until they are placed in situations that require quick decisions, speaking in front of a crowd or defending a viewpoint under doubt. And it is there that they discover the gap, not a gap in knowledge, but a gap in inner strength. The first breaking point is often very small, a circular answer, a forced smile, an unnecessary explanation. But the listener notices immediately. They sense the slight misalignment between what is being said and the state behind it. When pressure appears, most people return to old reactions. They speak faster, they speak more, they try to prove, they try to persuade. But each of these efforts pushes them further from their center. And the further they move from the center, the more the voice loses weight. This is a familiar spiral. Pressure leads to haste. Haste leads to lost rhythm. Lost rhythm leads to loss of authority. Loss of authority leads to doubt from others. And that doubt increases pressure even more. If you do not recognize this spiral in time, you will be carried by it without understanding why. Many people leave such moments with a sense of disappointment. They know they could have done better. They know they had something to say. But when it mattered, they could not say it in the way they intended. They blame themselves. Then they search for more techniques. But technique cannot save state. Only inner training can do that. The first breaking point is a warning. It does not come to defeat you. It comes to show you where work is needed. When you look back at the most pressured moments of your life, you will see a common pattern. You lose rhythm. You forget to breathe. You speak faster than usual. You try to fill space. This is not a personal flaw. It is the result of not having trained the inner system to remain grounded under challenge. People do not fail because they lack good intentions. They fail because they have not trained the ability to hold state when pushed out of the comfort zone. The breaking point is also where two paths diverge. One path leads back to the old world, blaming circumstances, telling yourself next time will be different, then continuing to react the same way. The other path is harder but more honest, looking directly at the truth that mastery is not yet there, not to feel shame, but to begin training. When you accept that pressure reveals essence, you no longer fear pressure. You begin to see it as a necessary test. Every difficult situation becomes a moment to see clearly where you stand, and only when you see clearly can you move forward. The first breaking point teaches one essential lesson. Influence is not built while you speak. It is built long before. It is built in moments when you practice pausing when no one asks, when you practice slow breathing when no one is watching, when you practice choosing words when no one is rushing you. When real pressure arrives, you no longer need to force anything. You simply return to what has been trained. And that is when steadiness appears. Quiet, unshowy, but strong enough for others to feel. This part of the journey is not comfortable, but it is honest, and that honesty opens the next door, the door of intentional choice. When you are no longer driven by pressure, you begin to lead yourself, and from there the ability to lead others finally has ground to form. There is a very thin boundary, yet it determines the entire journey. On one side is speaking to survive, on the other is speaking to lead. Most people do not realize where they are standing because they are accustomed to reacting. They are used to answering, so they are not left behind. They are used to speaking to hold their place. But the moment you step through this gateway, everything shifts. You no longer speak to prove your presence. You speak because you have chosen a direction. The difference is not volume or surface confidence. It is intention. The person who speaks to survive enters a conversation with an unspoken question in the mind. Am I being accepted? The person who speaks to lead enters with a different question. Where do I want to take this conversation? When the inner question changes, the outer state follows. You are no longer pulled by the reactions of others. You begin to hold rhythm. You allow silence to appear. You choose words instead of letting words spill out. This gateway of transformation does not open through motivation. It opens through decision. The decision to stop speaking on autopilot. The decision that every time you open your mouth, you take responsibility for the direction your words create. This may sound heavy, but it is liberating. Because when you take responsibility, you also take power. Power here is not control over others. It is the ability to remain steady regardless of the reactions around you. The person who speaks to lead does not need to please. They need to be clear. They do not need to speak fast. They need the right rhythm. They do not need to speak much. They need to speak precisely. And precision does not come from guessing others' intentions. It comes from knowing exactly what you stand for. When you stand firmly, you do not need defense. When you are not defensive, the voice naturally becomes deeper and stable. That stability creates a sense of safety for the listener, and when people feel safe, they are willing to follow. This gateway is also where many people turn back, because it requires letting go of something familiar. The habit of seeking immediate agreement. You must accept that not everyone will like your clarity. But clarity is always better than ambiguity. You may lose temporary comfort, but you gain long-term respect. The person who speaks to survive is often swept by the emotions of the room. The person who speaks to lead creates a new atmosphere without force, simply by holding a different rhythm, speaking slightly slower, pausing when needed, looking directly when saying what matters, and being willing to end the conversation once the message has been placed. This is a subtle but profound shift. You do not need to change who you are. You only change the inner position from which you speak. Instead of speaking from the fear of being overlooked, you speak from clarity of purpose. Instead of speaking to protect an image, you speak to shape direction. This gateway is not an explosive moment. It is a quiet but firm step. When you cross it, you will feel something very different. Relief. You no longer carry the pressure of pleasing everyone. You only need to be honest with where you are leading. And that honesty creates attraction. The rest of the journey will no longer be about seeking power. It will be about learning how to preserve and refine the state that has been opened. From here, every skill, every structure, every technique has a place, because you are no longer learning to cover weakness. You are learning to strengthen identity, and that is when the journey truly begins. There is no powerful voice if the thinking behind it is still unclear. Every word spoken is only the surface of a stream of thought flowing inside. If that stream is muddy, the words become diluted. If that stream is tangled, the sentences stumble. That is why the first pillar of leadership does not live in sound, but in inner clarity before the mouth opens. The person who speaks to lead does not begin by searching for elegant phrasing. They begin by identifying one single thing. What is the core point this sentence must place down? When you do not know what you want to say, you speak a lot. When you know exactly one thing you need to say, you do not need to add more. This clarity does not come from rushed thinking. It comes from intentional pause. Before responding, before reacting, before entering an important conversation, you need to stop long enough to examine your stream of thought. Am I reacting or choosing? Am I trying to protect myself or create direction? This pause may be just one breath, but in that breath you shift control from reflex to awareness. Most people fear the pause because they believe it makes them look weak. In reality, the pause is a sign of mastery. It allows you to gather your thoughts, remove noise, and select the core sentence. The core sentence is the one sentence that, if spoken alone, still gives the listener direction. Once you have the core, everything else becomes support. And if needed, you can let it go. Clear thinking also requires the courage to face uncertainty. There are moments when you do not yet have enough information. There are moments when the answer is not complete. The person who speaks to survive tries to speak anyway. The person who speaks to lead dares to say that more time is needed to think. This does not weaken you. It makes you more trustworthy. Because you are not selling false certainty, you are protecting accuracy. When you place accuracy above pleasing others, you build the foundation for long-term trust. Clear thinking also means knowing what not to say. Not every thought needs to be spoken. Not every detail needs to be shared. Leaders filter information before speaking. They respect the listener's capacity to receive. They understand that too much information removes direction. So they choose to speak what is most necessary in that moment. And this restraint creates a sense of steadiness. When you speak less but hit the mark, people lean in. They feel that you are holding the map. This pillar must be trained in very ordinary moments. When someone asks you a simple question, when you are asked to give an opinion, when you are about to reply to a message, each moment is an opportunity to practice pausing, to practice finding the core sentence, to practice speaking from the center. Perfection is not required. Intention is. Over time, clarity becomes habit. When the habit forms, you no longer need effort. Clear thinking appears naturally. And when thinking is clear, the voice automatically carries weight. You do not need to manufacture authority. Authority is a consequence. From this pillar, all other pillars gain their footing. Because when the foundation is solid, everything built on top can withstand pressure. And the next stage of the journey will go deeper into how that inner state is translated into sound that others can feel the moment you speak. When thinking is clear, the voice becomes the most honest channel for transmitting inner state. You do not need to learn how to speak louder or sound stronger. Authority does not come from volume. It comes from calmness. A calm voice tells the listener that there is no chaos inside you. And human beings are always drawn to stability. They seek it as an unconscious anchor. The voice directly reflects the nervous system. When you are tense, the breath becomes shallow. The rhythm accelerates, and the voice rises and tightens. When you are calm, the breath deepens, the rhythm slows, and the voice naturally becomes lower and grounded. No complex technique is required. You only need to learn how to breathe before speaking. One deep breath is not taken to relax, but to bring the body back into presence. When the body is present, the voice has a foundation. And when the voice has a foundation, the words carry weight. The person who speaks to survive lets emotion pull the voice around. They raise their tone to emphasize. They speed up when anxious. They soften when insecure. The person who speaks to lead does the opposite. They hold a steady rhythm. They do not rush when pressured. They do not change tone to seek attention. That stability causes the listener to adjust naturally. The room begins to slow down. Eye contact sharpens. This is not manipulation. It is natural synchronization between nervous systems. People always regulate themselves toward the most stable presence in the room. A calm voice also requires that you accept emotion rather than fight it. You may feel nervous, you may feel uncertain, but you do not allow those emotions to control the sound. You acknowledge them and continue speaking at your chosen rhythm. This honesty gives the voice depth. The listener senses that you are not performing. You are present. And presence creates attraction more powerfully than any technique. Another crucial element is the pause. A calm voice is not afraid to pause. The pause allows the listener to keep up. It creates rhythm. It emphasizes meaning without raising volume. When you pause after an important sentence, you give that sentence space to land. The person who speaks to survive fears the pause because they fear losing control. The person who speaks to lead understands that the pause is control. You decide when to speak and when to stop, and the listener follows that rhythm. This pillar must be trained in everyday life. When you make a phone call, when you answer a difficult question, when you say no to a request, each situation becomes a training room. You notice your breath. You speak slightly slower than instinct. You allow pauses to appear. Gradually, a calm voice becomes your default. And when it becomes default, you no longer need to think about it. Authority appears as a natural consequence. Others will say that you seem very grounded. But inside, you know, it is not performance. It is the result of having mastered your rhythm. When the voice has become an anchor, the next pillar can begin to function. Words no longer float. They are placed on a stable foundation. And from there, each sentence, each word begins to carry real weight. When thinking is clear and the voice is steady, language becomes the blade that shapes direction. Every word you choose or remove sends a signal. The person who speaks to lead does not use words as decoration. They use words to place focus. Precise language does not need ornament. It needs to stand in the right place. One correct word can replace an entire long explanation. One concise sentence can clarify what 10 roundabout sentences never reach. Most people lose weight in their speech not because they lack words, but because they have too many. They use softening phrases to protect themselves. They add words to reduce risk, but that addition weakens the sentence. When you say maybe, perhaps, I think you are handing control to uncertainty. The listener senses this immediately. Precise language begins with removal. Removing words that do not serve direction. Removing sentences that are unnecessary. Removing the need to explain everything. You do not need to prove that you are intelligent. You need to show that you know what you are talking about. And the only way to do that is to choose words with intention. The person who speaks to lead places sentences in a declarative form when there is foundation. They do not speak to impress. They speak to create decision. They understand that a strong message must answer one very specific question. After hearing this, what should the listener do? When you do not know what action you want the listener to take, you choose vague words. When you are clear about the desired action, language naturally sharpens. This pillar also requires that you take responsibility for what you say. Precise language does not allow exaggeration. It does not allow promises beyond capacity. It chooses honesty over temporary appeal. When you speak what can stand, you do not need defense. And when you are not defensive, the words have footing. The listener senses that your words do not slip. They anchor in reality. Another important factor is sentence structure. Precise language often comes with short sentences. Short sentences force clarity. Long sentences allow avoidance. When you train yourself to speak in short sentences, you are training your thinking. You do not give yourself room to ramble. You choose the main point, and then you stop. That pause allows the listener to process, and in that space, weight is created. This pillar must be practiced deliberately. When you write, when you speak, when you think, you ask yourself one simple question. Is this word necessary? Does this sentence push direction? If not, you remove it. At first, this will be difficult. You will feel that you are speaking less. But very quickly, you will notice something. When you speak less, others listen more. When you choose words carefully, people begin to believe that you choose carefully in other areas as well. Precise language does not only shape the message, it shapes your image in the listener's mind. When this pillar stands firm, your message is no longer dissolved in noise. It becomes a landmark, and from that landmark, others know where they are and which way to move. This is when words begin to carry real influence. When language is precise, structure becomes the skeleton that keeps a message standing under pressure. Without structure, speech collapses when questioned. The person who speaks to lead does not speak from emotional flow. They speak in order. This order is not rigid. It is clear. The listener needs to know where they are in the message and where it is going next. When you speak without structure, the listener must assemble the pieces themselves, and most will give up. Leadership structure begins with the main point, not with long context, not with reasons. The main point is placed first like a stake in the ground. Everything that follows exists only to clarify or support that stake. When the listener knows the focal point, they follow. When they follow, they are ready to receive detail. This is how you maintain leadership. You do not need to say more. You need to place order correctly. A simple but powerful structure is to state the core, then give the reason, then end with direction. The core answers the question what this is about. The reason answers why it matters. The direction answers what to do next. When these three elements are clear, the listener is not left hanging. They know what comes next. The person who speaks to survive often ends with openness. They finish and leave it there. The person who speaks to lead ends with a closing point, not a command, clarity. You do not force action. You give a direction clear enough for others to choose. Structure also helps you stay calm when interrupted. When you know where you are, you do not panic. You simply return to the stake. You restate the main point. Then you continue. This creates a sense of steadiness. The listener feels that you are not being pulled. You are leading. Another important aspect of structure is knowing when to stop. Speaking too long dilutes the message. Leaders know how to end sooner than instinct. When the point has been placed, they stop. They leave space for the message to settle. This pillar must be trained in every interaction. When you tell a story, when you present an idea, when you give feedback, you practice placing the main point first. You practice ending with direction. At first, this may feel dry, but very quickly you will see the effect. Others understand faster. They ask better questions. And most importantly, they act more. When structure is solid, you no longer fear being misunderstood because you have guided the path. You no longer fear interruption because you know where you are. Structure gives you a frame to hold calmness. And within that frame, your voice, language, and thinking work together as one coherent flow. This is when your message is not only heard, it is followed. Even when thinking is clear, the voice is steady, language is precise, and structure is strong. Everything can still collapse. If emotion takes control, pressure does not ask whether you are prepared. It arrives suddenly through a challenging question, a skeptical look, or a prolonged silence. And in that moment, emotion rises. If you react, you lose rhythm. If you lose rhythm, you lose leadership. Mastering emotion does not mean feeling nothing. It means you do not allow emotion to drive your words. The person who speaks to lead recognizes emotion the moment it appears. They notice the heart rate increase. They notice the breath tighten. And instead of pushing it away, they slow down. Slowing down is the most powerful action in a pressured environment. When you slow down, you send a signal that you are not threatened, and the nervous system of the listener responds accordingly. Most weak reactions come from trying to protect image. You fear being judged. You fear losing position. You fear being seen as not knowing. Those fears cause emotion to surge, and language becomes defensive. A leader places clarity above ego. They do not need to win the moment. They need to hold direction. When you prioritize direction, emotion naturally settles. One critical skill here is the ability to tolerate discomfort without acting on it. You may hear criticism. You may face doubt. But you do not need to counter immediately. You allow a pause. In that pause, emotion passes through, and when it passes, you are still there with clarity intact. The person who speaks to survive fears this pause. They fill it with reaction. The person who speaks to lead uses it to maintain control. Mastering emotion also means you do not borrow the energy of the room. If the room is tense, you do not tense with it. If the room is anxious, you do not become anxious. You hold your state, and that state gradually spreads. This is not manipulation, it is stability. People seek stability in chaos. This pillar must be trained in real situations. When you are interrupted, when you are challenged, when you are misunderstood. Each moment becomes a drill. You observe emotion. You do not identify with it. You return to the breath. Then you continue speaking from the place that has been trained. Gradually, you realize something important. Emotion does not disappear, but it no longer controls you. You can speak difficult truths without losing calm. You can remain silent without feeling weak. You can end a conversation without needing to prove anything. When you can do this, others sense a very different kind of strength. Not dominating strength, but the strength of someone who cannot be pulled from the center. And when you cannot be pulled, you set the rhythm. This is a point very few reach, but once you do, there is no going back, because you now know what mastery feels like. And from here, a more subtle instrument begins to appear. The instrument of silence, an instrument only those who are truly grounded dare to use. When you have mastered emotion, silence is no longer a frightening void. It becomes a tool very few people know how to use because it requires real steadiness. Silence is not the absence of speech. Silence is the choice not to speak at the right moment. And that choice sends a stronger signal than any words. The person who speaks to survive sees silence as loss of control. The person who speaks to lead sees silence as a way to hold regulation. When you pause after an important sentence, you give that sentence space. The listener is forced to process. They turn inward, and in that moment, weight is created. Silence also gives you time to observe. You read the rhythm of the room. You sense the energy. You see who is following and who is drifting. A leader does not rush to pull everyone along. They adjust the rhythm so others can follow. Sometimes that adjustment is simply a pause. When the room is tense, silence cools it down. When the room is noisy, silence creates a stop point. You do not need to speak louder to be heard. You speak less and you pause. And very often, all eyes turn toward you. This is not a trick. It is a natural human response to contrast. In an environment full of noise, the person who holds silence at the right time stands out. Silence is also how you demonstrate confidence in what you have said. When you finish speaking and pause, you show that you believe the sentence can stand on its own. You do not need to add. You do not need to explain. That belief transfers to the listener. They sense that you are not anxious about being misunderstood. You have placed the message down, and you are willing to let it do its work. Another crucial element is the ability to endure silence under challenge. When someone does not respond immediately, when there is a skeptical look, when no answer comes right away, the person who speaks to survive fills the space. The person who speaks to lead holds silence for one more beat. That beat is enough for emotion to settle, enough for the other person to speak or act. And often, in that beat, regulation shifts back into your hands. Regulating the room does not mean controlling others. It is the ability to hold the shared rhythm without being pulled by any individual. You slow when slowing is needed. You speak when speaking is needed. You stop when stopping is needed. This flexibility is only possible when you no longer fear being overlooked, when you trust the value of your presence. This pillar must be trained gradually. You do not need to create long silences. You begin by not adding words when they are unnecessary. You finish the sentence and you stop. You allow others to respond. Over time, you will notice the change. Conversations become deeper. Others speak more deliberately, and you no longer have to strain to hold rhythm. Silence does that work for you. When you become comfortable with this tool, you begin to sense something very different. You are no longer inside the conversation. You are above it. You can see the whole field. And from that position, you can guide rhythm gently yet effectively. This is one of the clearest signs of mastery. And when you have mastered the room rhythm, you are ready for a more subtle challenge. Reading people and context to speak at the right moment in the right way. When you have mastered silence and room rhythm, the next step is no longer about what to say, but when to say it and to whom. The same message placed at the wrong moment creates resistance. Placed at the right moment, it becomes guidance. The person who speaks to lead does not impose their message onto the context. They read the context first and then place their words into it. Reading people is not judging personality. It is sensing state. Is the listener tense or open? Are they defensive or searching for direction? When you speak without reading state, you may be right but unheard. And being right without being heard creates no change. Timing holds most of the power of a message. One sentence spoken at the right moment can replace 10 sentences spoken out of rhythm. Leaders observe before they intervene. They listen to breathing, eye contact, and speaking speed of the other person. These small signals reveal whether readiness is present. When readiness is not there, the leader does not force. They slow down. They ask questions. They open space. When readiness appears, they speak directly. No circling, no padding. Reading context also means understanding your role in that moment. Sometimes you are the guide. Sometimes you are the stabilizer. Sometimes you are the listener. If you try to lead before your moment arrives, you create pushback. The person who speaks to survive tries to assert presence at all times. The person who speaks to lead chooses moments to appear. And that restraint is what gets them invited to speak. Speaking at the right moment also means knowing when not to speak. There are times when silence carries more information than words. There are moments when listening is the strongest form of leadership. When you give others space, they feel respected, and from respect, trust forms. When trust is present, your later words travel far. This pillar requires inner humility. You must accept that you do not need to appear at every moment, but when you do appear, it must carry value. You do not speak to fill space. You speak to create movement. When you can read people and context, you no longer need to speak much. You only need to speak accurately. And accuracy here is not about content. It is about rhythm. The listener senses that you are with them, not above them. And when people feel met where they are willing to take the next step. This is the most subtle art of leadership. Not loud, not forced, but deeply effective. When you master this, your words no longer slide past. They land where they are meant to. And from that point, transformation no longer requires effort. It becomes the natural result of choosing the right moment to appear. No lasting leadership is built from brief flashes of brilliance. All real strength comes from repetition, sustained long enough for skill to stop being a conscious action and become identity. At this stage, you no longer have to think about clear thinking, calm voice, precise language, or message structure. They appear naturally the way you walk. And that naturalness creates a sense of solidity in the listener. They do not feel that you are applying techniques. They feel that you are simply being yourself. Identity is formed when you choose to repeat the fundamentals even when no one is watching. When you pause before answering even without pressure. When you choose short sentences even when no one asks. When you hold silence even when you could say more. These small choices accumulate into a stable state. That state follows you into every conversation. The person who speaks to survive practices only when needed. The person who speaks to lead practices every day. Not to be perfect, but to be consistent. Consistency is what creates deep trust. When others see you hold the same rhythm across different situations, they know you are reliable. You do not change with the wind. You do not react to fleeting emotion. You have a center, and that center shows itself through your voice and your presence. Identity also means you are no longer tempted by the need to prove. You do not need to win arguments. You do not need to say the best line. You need to hold the right direction. When you have repeated long enough, you realize that power does not live in doing more. It lives in doing less but more accurately. You know when to intervene and when to step back. You are not pulled by attention. You choose where to place energy. This is a sign of inner maturity. Many people confuse confidence with stability. Confidence can rise and fall. Stability does not. Identity is built on stability. And stability only arrives when you repeat the basics long enough for them to become a new reflex. At that point, pressure no longer breaks you. It only activates what has been trained. You do not need to think about what to do. You already know, and that knowing does not live in the mind. It lives in the body, in the breath, in the voice, in the way you pause. This is when you no longer learn to change yourself. You learn to keep yourself from drifting away from the center. And that act of holding creates a powerful difference. Others may not be able to name what makes them trust you, but they feel it, and that feeling is enough for them to follow. When skill has become identity, the journey is no longer effort. It becomes a way of living, and from that way of living, every word you speak carries natural weight. At this stage, the change no longer lives in what others immediately see. It lives in how they feel when they are near you, when they listen to you, when they enter the same space. The voice is no longer a tool you use. It is a natural expression of an inner world trained over time. You no longer need to try to stay calm. Calm has become the baseline state. You no longer need to try to be clear. Clarity is already present before words appear. When the inner world is grounded, the voice automatically has an axis. That axis keeps every message from drifting, tilting, or breaking under challenge. The listener senses consistency. They see that you speak the same way in a meeting room and in everyday life. You hold the same rhythm when supported and when questioned. This consistency creates a deep form of trust. No promises are required. No assertions are needed. It is present in how you pause, how you respond, how you close. This is complete transformation. Not because you have learned enough skills, but because you no longer need to think about skills. They have merged into you. The voice at this point does not seek agreement. It invites participation. Not imposing, not defensive. It places a direction and allows others to choose. And that freedom is what makes people choose to follow. You are no longer pulled by the need to please. You do not need to appear tough either. You stand in the middle, grounded, clear, present. When pressure comes, you do not shrink. When opportunity comes, you do not perform. You hold the same axis. That axis is what others feel as strength. But you know it is not external strength. It is the result of having chosen to train from the inside. This transformation changes how you enter every relationship. You speak less, yet are heard more. You do not push in. You are invited. You do not prove. Your presence speaks for you. This is not the final destination. It is a new baseline state. From here, every other journey in life gains leverage because you have mastered the most important gate. The gate between inner world and outer world. And when that gate is solid, you are no longer afraid to speak what you believe. You know your voice is strong enough to carry the truth you choose to live by. This journey does not end here. It returns to the most familiar place, everyday life. But you are no longer the same person stepping back into the same situations. You carry a new responsibility. Responsibility for every word you speak and every direction that word creates. When you understand that the voice is the gate connecting the inner world to the outer world, you no longer treat speaking as something trivial. Every sentence you release reinforces an identity, either the old identity of reaction and defense, or the new identity of clarity and mastery. No one forces you to choose. But you are no longer unconscious, and that is the greatest difference. You begin to see that life does not change through grand resolutions. It changes through very small moments. The moment you pause before answering. The moment you choose silence instead of explanation. The moment you speak one clear sentence instead of 10 safe ones. Those moments accumulate. They build a new trajectory. A trajectory where you are not pulled by circumstance. You generate direction from within. The responsibility of mastery is not heavy. It is liberating. Because when you take responsibility, you no longer need to blame anyone else. You do not wait for others to understand you. You clarify. You do not hope others will trust you. You show up grounded enough for trust to form naturally. You do not try to control outcomes. You control state. And that state is enough to guide outcomes to the right place. Returning to daily life also means accepting that there will still be moments when you lose rhythm, moments of fatigue, moments of distraction. But the difference is that you recognize it quickly. You return to center early. You do not allow one slip to pull the entire day off course. You do not let one reaction distort the entire direction. Mastery does not mean never missing the mark. It means you do not drift far before coming back. And every return strengthens trust in yourself. From here, your voice no longer only influences others, it shapes your own life. You speak to the world with clarity, and the world responds with respect. You speak to yourself with calm, and the inner world responds with stability. Every relationship, every decision, every turning point is shaped by this, quiet, unshowy, but enduring. If there is one thing to carry with you after this story closes, it is this: you do not need to speak more to live differently. You need to speak with more intention. And when your words carry intention, your life will begin to move in the same direction. This is not a promise, it is a consequence. And from this moment, the choice is in your hands. You have reached the end of this journey, and if you are still here, it means that a very deep part of you is ready to live differently. What you have just heard is not a story meant to create temporary emotion, but a map. A map that shows why your voice, your thinking, and the way you show up are directly shaping your inner strength and your level of influence in life. You have seen that mastering communication does not begin with speaking more, but with being clearer, calmer, and more structured in every word you speak. When you master your inner state, your voice naturally carries weight, and others willingly listen. Thank you for giving your time and attention to walk this journey all the way through. If this content offered you a new perspective or made you pause and reflect on how you are living, take one small action right now. Press like to support the channel, share this video with someone you believe needs to hear it, and subscribe to continue walking alongside future deep inspirations.